We're excited to have Ann Palmer back here talking. She did a lecture last year on the hood ornaments. So I don't know if any of you came to that, but that was one thing she did. So just a brief little intro here to Ann. Ann has been on our research and advisory team pretty much from the beginning, so for about 3 years now. So we're excited to have her as part of that team. Ann grew up in Pittsburgh, Kansas, small town girl. So her love of vehicles got started at a very early age, kind of influenced from her parents. Her mom got her driver's license at the age of 16 in the 1920s, which was pretty much
in 1920.
Oh, in 1920. So there you go. Yeah. So when that's pretty unheard of for a young lady to do that. So that's kind of where her love of vehicles started, and her father helped influence that as well. Her mom also was a very avid fan of Frank Lloyd Wright. So that also got Ann started on the architecture side of things and stuff. She graduated from KU. She had 2 degrees, and we don't talk about KU here. So and she went on to teach there in Topeka for a few years, and then kind of changed course and ended up getting her master's in landscape architecture, and that is what she has been doing and is still doing to this day. So her and her husband Jerry, who's here in the back, they have 2 grown children and 6 grandchildren. So she's a busy, busy lady, but we're very excited to have her, and I'm going to let her give you a little more background, and then she's going to get started on her talk here. So let's give her a big welcome.
I'm just delighted to do this, and as Sherry said, they asked me, I think it's been about 2.5 years ago, and they were looking for somebody who was an expert in the vintage 20s, 30s cars, and maybe even into the 40s. And I was looking for somebody who'd be interested in my hood ornament photography. And so they invited me to join this team. Larry is here, and Eric from Wamego was there too, and now Sherry's husband, right there, is in the group. And that first meeting took about an hour and a half, and they kept thanking me for coming all the way from Topeka, for this meeting in this group. And I said, look, I've been here an hour and a half. The only thing we've talked about continually is cars, and none of us have looked over anyone's shoulder to find somebody else to talk to, which is what usually happens to me when I start talking about cars. So it's been a delight. I have, and I will tell you a couple of caveats at the beginning. I am a Frank Lloyd Wright fan, unadulterated, even after learning more than I wanted to know about him. And indeed, as Sherry said, my mother was a big fan and talked about his organic architecture idea. So, also, the other caveat is it's hard to find photographs, not of his cars, but that's almost impossible, but of cars the same year. And so I finally managed, the pictures on the internet are usually too small, they pixelate when you blow them up. So in desperation, I took pictures of the cars' pictures on my computer screen with my camera. And some of them work great, and some of them you can tell, maybe not. But the way I found out, I thought I knew everything about Frank Lloyd Wright. And then a few years ago, Jerry and I went to one of the places I had always wanted to go, which was the Auburn Cord Duesenberg Museum in Auburn, Indiana. Maybe some of you, I see you nodding, have been there. A wonderful place. And that's where I saw Frank Lloyd Wright's L29 1929 cord, painted Cherokee red. And discovered also his 52 Crosley Hotshot, and discovered that he maybe owned quite a few cars. So that had piqued my interest and led me down a winding path. When I started this project, it was just to find his cars. and to show them to you. What I discovered, which was actually far more interesting, is how important the car and the automobile was to him. There is one thing I'd like to read to you. It came from an architecture magazine. And it said, beauty, excitement, freedom. Whatever particular element of the automobile appealed to him, the outcome was the same. He worshiped the car in a way that would make any modern enthusiast proud. We need to thank him for not designing around the car, but in synthesis with the car. Structures built in harmony with nature and transportation incorporated seamlessly in between. How many cents have been as influential in this regard? And as I continue with the program, you will see exactly what that person means. This is a classic picture of Wright in his older years. And I don't know if you can see, it says a lifetime of fascination in red. This is a more classic picture of Wright, probably in his prime. I thought until I read for this program that he was probably about 6'2". He was not anywhere near that. He was a relatively small man, but he dressed in bulky clothes. Often you see him in capes and heavy coats to make himself appear larger. He was a shameless promoter, but unlike many self-promoters, he also was a genius, and he had a lot to promote. If you are looking for a really fine study of his life, both his architecture and allusions to his automobiles, you can either buy, or as I did, rent from my local library, Ken Burns' Frank Lloyd Wright. It's only a couple of hours long and is very, very good. The first thing I'm going to do is just a very brief overlay of his life. He was born in 1867, which was only 2 years after the Civil War. Yet I still tend to think of him as such a modernist, but he was just after the Civil War. He was born in Wisconsin, near where Taliesin was built and still stands. His mother, Anna, believed that his birth was prophetic. She decided in utero that he was going to be a master builder and an architect. And when he was born, she put etchings and drawings of the world's greatest cathedrals in his room. She told him constantly that he was special, that he was chosen for greatness. Now, I don't know if he would have been this way without the mother, and we'll never know. But she was certainly devoted to making him somebody. He practiced 70 years, built monumental and intimate spaces. He was celebrated, ridiculed and forgotten, and celebrated again, all in that lifetime. He broke virtually all the rules. He did his best work living on the edge and felt good when he was in desperate trouble. Fortunately for architecture, he was in desperate trouble a great deal. And so that is when he did some of his best work. One of his students said about him that he was a 200% alive all the time. He was interviewed by Mike Wallace in an interview program in the late 50s. I saw it on Ken Burns' program. And Mike Wallace leaned back and the cigarette smoke is wafting up and said, "I understand that you are the greatest living American architect." And he said, "Why have you included living and American?" And he was a man in his later 70s at that point. He had a melodramatic life. I think that is putting it mildly. He basically had 4 wives. He left his first wife and 6 children. When he was 42, he lived in Oak Park, and he left her for a woman called Mema. It was a huge scandal in 1908. Neither spouse would give him a divorce, so he abandoned all his work, and they went to Europe for a year. This was not looked on well by people in Chicago who wanted buildings and homes built. He started Taliesin in 1910. His business had picked up. They were living at Taliesin with 2 of her young children, and neither had been able to get a divorce. He was working in Chicago right at that particular day, and there were about 7 people at Taliesin, including Mema, her 2 children, the cook, the man who did the yard, and some others. And their butler took a gasoline can and emptied it all around the edge of Taliesin and then lit it. And as the house went up, he hacked to death the 7 people who fled. You know, I had forgotten that story, I think deliberately, because it is so awful. But Wright got on the train and came back to Taliesin, did what was necessary, but obviously it was a terrible, terrible thing. He started rebuilding Taliesin immediately, and in the year before, he had been to Japan because they'd approached him about building a large hotel. Well, he got the job in 1916. He spent off and on 6 years in Tokyo and built the Imperial Hotel, which has been added on to, but parts still remain. And that really set him on a course for sort of monumental projects. By the end of the 20s, he was broke, and the bank had taken Taliesin, and that's the part where he was forgotten. Well, by the end of the 30s, he was the most famous architect in the United States and had more work than he could use. So that's a little bit background of who we're talking about. From the very beginning, and this part I never knew until I started the study for this program. This is Taliesin, which he started in 1910. And Jerry and I were fortunate enough to go there a couple of years ago. I'd always wanted to. And if you've not gone, worth every minute. It's absolutely gorgeous. But he built a 4-car garage then in 1910. This was a house he built in 1941 it may have been a Usonian house, which were the mass-produced single-story houses built during the Depression. But all of the Usonian houses had carports, as did this one. And I asked Doug, I sent him this picture. He said that's a 63 Series E Jaguar. So the picture was taken later than the house. This is the famous Roby House, and many of you have seen it, I'm sure. He built it in 1908 in Chicago, South Side, near the University of Chicago. He did not own a car at this time, but he built in 1908 an attached garage, 3-car garage, with a pit in one of them to work on cars and an area for washing cars. That I don't know how many cars there were on the south side of Chicago in 1908, not many. So that showed early on how important he thought cars were. He thought they would bring life to rural areas. He thought they would give personal freedom, and he believed very correctly that it would change the way everyone lived. This is perhaps his most famous work. My husband and I were on our way to Cheyenne Bottoms in Quivira this week, and Jerry found a list from the Smithsonian of a certain number of things that you should see anywhere in the world. Not a whole lot of them were in the United States. But you know what one of them was? Falling water. The falling water is interesting for any number of reasons, but one of them is Edgar Kaufman, who owned a department store in Pittsburgh, became a very large patron of Frank Lloyd Wright. He liked his work, and I had always assumed that Falling Water was a permanent house. No, it was a weekend place for Edgar Kaufman and his family outside of Pittsburgh. So he talked to Wright about what he wanted. They loved this waterfall. And Mr. Kaufman assumed that he would build them a house where they would have a view of the waterfall they liked. So he had the conversation, and I don't know, months went by, and he was in Milwaukee, Mr. Kaufman, and he called Frank Lloyd Wright in Spring Green, Wisconsin, in Taliesin, and said, "I'm only 3 hours away. I think I'll drive up, and I'm eager to see the plans." He said, "We'll be ready for you." There were no plans. But as a designer, I can understand. He clearly had been working this in his head for months. And so he had 3 hours and a lot of students, because by that time he had organized his School of Architecture. And their job was to bring in pencils as he either broke them or wore them down. And in 3 hours, all of the plans were ready when Mr. Kaufman got there from Milwaukee, which I think is a great story. It sort of blew the minds of people in 1935 of the way houses could fit into the landscape. And as it said, this was the height of the Depression. And many of the workers who worked on this loved the work and dreamed that they too might someday have something like this. Now, you may notice the red Mazda over in the corner. I got this from a Mazda ad on the internet. This is I would call it the back of Falling Water, but I'm not sure where the front door is. But this is the upper level, and it had 4 carports. And I saw a list of Mr. Kaufman's cars, which included a very, very large and expensive Packard, a Hupmobile, and a number of other cars. So by this time, as opposed to the Roby house, he was doing carports, because as he said to Mr. Kaufman, cars are not horses. They do not need to be contained. And garages are only for clutter. So he'd gone to the carport. I don't know how many of you believe that about garages, but I certainly do. I keep Okay, this was also a project of Mr. Kaufman's. He was, in the late 40s, part of the Pittsburgh Renaissance. At that time, Pittsburgh was a steel mill city, and it was dirty and run down, and particularly in its inner city. So he asked Frank Lloyd Wright to build a Coney Island style project for the center of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Well, he loved, as you will see later, the spiral. He loved it. And he loved cars. And you have to take yourself back to the view of cars in the late 40s. He had people coming into town. That's a parking garage for 1,200 cars in a swirl. And inside there were all the shops and entertainment and movie theaters and whatever. Well, the powers that be in Pittsburgh were not thrilled. And this was never built. But it was an example of why he thought cars needed to be a part of any city. At the same time, or soon after, and this is a rendering, because it too was never built. This was in 1924, and a very wealthy man from Maryland wanted to bring tourists to Sugarloaf Mountain, which was in Maryland. And so Frank Lloyd Wright built this. Again, this has cars and parking as you go up in the swirl. And he included a planetarium in it, a aquarium, a whole variety of things, family-oriented, that you could drive the whole family there and use. The very conservative businessman looked at the plans and said, "Oh, it's the Tower of Babel." And it went nowhere. In fact, there is a whole book, I've seen the cover, entitled Unbuilt Plans of Frank Lloyd Wright. I mention this only because, again, of the car. Now, that's probably the most famous swirl and probably the greatest tour de force that he ever designed, the Guggenheim in New York. He was approached in 1943 about doing it, but it was a big deal as to who was going to decide. They looked where the best location would be all over the boroughs. They decided on Manhattan, and he wanted to build a one-story, sprawling, prairie-style museum. But he discovered that land is too valuable in Manhattan. And so he did this, and the ramps that you go up in the Guggenheim are basically 3%, occasionally 5%, the same as automobiles would use in a parking garage. And he wanted everyone to take the elevator to the top and then go down and see the art. Apparently, it's been said that people come to the Guggenheim to see art, but what they're really there for is to see Frank Lloyd Wright. And the people who have to hang the art accurately on the tilting curves of the walkways are not happy. I'll leave it at that. And if anybody's been to the Guggenheim, you know it's so crowded you could never get everybody in the elevator to the top. But it was finally finished and opened in 1956. So there was a long, long period. He believed that filling stations, as they called them then, were going to replace the train station for where people met and exchanged things and popularity. So he designed 2 filling stations. This one, he built a home for this man in Colquitt, Minnesota. And he owned a filling station. So, and I'm sure if he had Frank Lloyd Wright build his house, he owned some other things too. But this still is operating, and you can see the classic totem, as he called it, that goes up. And he designed an area where you could go up and, if you weren't working, and look out to the landscape and watch for the cars to come. This is the other one he designed in Buffalo, New York, and it was never built. So there's I've not been, I'd like to go, but a very fine Pierce Arrow Museum in Buffalo. And so in 2015, they got the plans, got the money, and they enlarged their museum and built an exact copy of that filling station. And if you can see the details of the lights here and the step above where the workers could sit and enjoy themselves and look out, it, I think, was a very beautiful filling station. I'm going to throw in right here that in 1949, in 1932, he started a school of architecture. And in Taliesin East, which was, in my terms, the real Taliesin, they would work in the spring and summer. And then in the winter, they would take this cavalcade of 30 students, cars, food, camping equipment, and go to Scottsdale, Arizona, where the other Taliesin was. And so I've forgotten where I was going. Oh, yes, that's why he knew about Arizona. So in 1949, he designed a bank for a wealthy banker in Tucson. And he put a drive-up window where they could have a teller and drive through and do their banking. The bankers had apoplexy and said that the idea that anyone would ever do banking from a car was preposterous. And so the bank was built, but not the drive-up teller. Now, I have two pictures of this because it's so cool. And the one is original of the time. There was a man named Max Hoffman. I have to keep checking, I don't want to go over. Max Hoffman, who was the first importer, supposedly, of Porsches, Mercedes, Jaguars on a real commercial level in New York. And in 1954, his showroom was at 56th and Park, right in a lovely area of Midtown near Central Park. And it was only 3,600 square feet. That's not very big. And he had a lot of cars to show. So he asked Frank Lloyd Wright to design his showroom. There, in the showroom, like this pole right here, was a big pole, but it was bigger, and it was in the center of the showroom. And they couldn't move it. So he decided to build his favorite spiral around the pole and up, so all of these cars could be displayed. And you can see the age of this, which was probably mid-50s. Then here is a later version where you can see it even more. And if you wanted to see the individual cars, you just walked up the ramp, which enabled him to show a lot more cars than he could have put on that very small showroom floor. The sad part is, and I've read now several articles of blaming and finger pointing, but apparently the Landmark Commission in New York was asleep at the switch, and they very quickly ripped this out and turned it into a bank in 2013. So it's gone.
Was the driver pointed?
Yeah, no, yeah, probably. Oh. Okay, now we start the cars, so I've got to get my list here. All right. Another caveat, how do you choose? I knew I couldn't take pictures. It would take 2 days, to do this. So I picked the cars I liked, and I thought were typical of the various eras and uses. Now, the first car listed is this, a 1911 Knox Roadster. He did have a previous car called the Yellow Devil that was a 1908 car, but he rented it. And at that time, he was one of only 2 people in Oak Park, Illinois, which was then a suburb of Chicago, which is now kind of an inner suburb of Chicago. And it would go 60 miles an hour. And he tooled around Oak Park in a linen duster, goggles, in this Yellow Devil. And one of his sons said he was constantly paying tickets. But apparently what the car was really infamous for was, that's where the affair between he and Mamie started, was in the Yellow Devil. So this was a Knox Roadster. Larry, you may know more about a Knox than me. I'm not familiar much with a Knox. This is a 1912 Cadillac Phaeton Roadster. What's interesting about this, it had the first electric start. And I'll tell you why it may have attracted Frank Lloyd Wright. He broke his arm cranking the Knox. And so I think he decided he liked that idea of an electric start. Okay, 1923 Type 61 Cadillac. Here's the important part about this. It was designed by Harley Earl. Those of you who probably are mostly car people know Harley Earl as the inventor of the Corvette. He was the chief designer for General Motors and vice president of design for many, many years. And it is a pretty sporty looking car. Okay, 1928 Ford Model A, Phaeton E. I don't necessarily know what some of these, the letter E is. Then, here is his favorite car, which is an L29, 1929 Cord. Of course, these are not his cars. These are pictures I could find of the Wright models. He loved it so much that in the 50s, one of his students hunted down a 1929 L29 and gave it to him. He thought it was the most prestigious car that he had ever owned. Yes, he liked cars. Yes, he collected cars. He did not take care of cars. He apparently drove the devil out of them, did not take good care of them, and that's why there's so few of his originals around, because they just wore out. All right. At 1936 Ford Station Wagon in Woody. Now, remember I told you in 32 he started his apprentice program for architecture. And we'll start to see a lot of cars that he owned that carried stuff. And that was part of these trips. He never wanted to go the same way twice to Arizona. And in one interesting story, they went through Wichita, and former Governor Allen, and this was in the mid-30s, invited the entire group to dinner in his home that Frank Lloyd Wright designed. Many of you have probably seen it in Wichita, near downtown, near East Side. That house is the only Kansas Frank Lloyd Wright house anywhere. There are 2 in Kansas City, Missouri, near downtown. That's as close as we come. Then, one of my favorites is this 1936 Lincoln Zephyr 2-door sedan. Isn't that just gorgeous? When they would make these treks, the students were in, as we'll see later, some of these Bantam small cars and bulky cars to carry things, but he always started late and got there first and drove the most prestigious car he owned. Isn't that a cute thing? That is a 1939 Bantam Speedster, 4-passenger, and he bought 3 of them. Now, when they were Crosleys and Bantams, he bought them almost by the gross, many at a time. One of my other supreme favorites, the 1940 Lincoln Zephyr Coupe. I think this is the one they called a drop head, and people who know me from the museum know that I am one of those car people who is only interested in the outside. I know very little about the engine or much. And I always thought when I saw drop head it referred to an engine. No, it refers to the way the canvas top on the back of the convertible is.
In English.
What?
The English is.
Oh, is that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
They're drop heads.
Drop heads.
This is a cabriolet.
Yeah. And that means
Convertible.
what?
Cabriolet is convertible.
Oh, okay. All right. Now I've lost my place. Okay. This is the iconic Frank Lloyd Wright car. I have 2 pictures of it, and if you're really interested, this is the most concise and best book. The Car is Architecture, which is a quote from Wright, and that car is on the cover. It was originally a 1941 Lincoln Continental 2-door sedan. It was in a series of accidents, and in 1948, he had it completely remodeled. This is the remodeled car. The other car looked pretty traditional. Here is a more beautiful picture of the remodeled one. And it had these 2 little opera windows, and he made it like for the chauffeur in the front, and there's no back window. And when asked why he didn't have a back window, he said, "I never look back." Okay. The only motorcycle he purchased was in 1943, but it was a 1930 Harley Davidson, and this was during the war, and it could be that he couldn't buy any cars, and so he bought a motorcycle. I don't know if he ever rode it or other people did or whatever. Then, right after the war, he bought a 1946 Willys Jeep CJ2A civilian Jeep. I maybe thought it was cute, or maybe he thought they used it in Arizona in the sand. Now, here might be my very favorite, it's the second favorite. It's a Jaguar Mark V, Mark V 4, 2-door convertible. And you know, you've seen a lot of fancy cars, and you may say, how come when he was ridiculed and forgotten and went bankrupt and they took Taliesin until a patron brought it back for him? How did he buy all these cars? Okay, go back to Japan when he was there for the 6 years to build the Imperial Hotel. He became fascinated with Japanese prints, and he bought thousands of them. They turned out to make more money for him than many of his works of architecture because they became very valuable. So if he didn't have any money but was desperate to have a flashy car, he just sold Japanese prints. Left the rest of his collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. All right. This, I don't know how many of you know, is an Austin Somerset A40 four-door sedan. He really liked small cars and big cars, kind of not so much in between. I put this in because this was always the car I dreamed of having, always, when I was little, younger, old. I'll never have it. But it's the 52, from 48 to 52, they were the same. The TD Roadster, the classic English sports car. I think he bought it just probably because he liked it too. These were two, this one and the next one, of his Crosleys. This is one of the rare pictures of his real car with him and his fourth wife, Olga Vanna, that he married in the late 20s, early 30s. She was only 26 and I believe he was 62. But it was a relationship that lasted until he died in 1959. She was a tremendous businesswoman. She was from Eastern Europe, had studied under a Russian mystic, but she knew how to run people and organizations, and it was a perfect match. And that is a Crosley Hotshot. He bought, or Super Sport, pardon me. He bought 6 of those. Then this, you may recognize, is a Chevrolet Suburban, 1953. And I thought, wow, I wonder if that was the first Suburban. But many of you are probably smarter than me. Do you know when the first Suburban came out?
35.
35. Yeah. I was amazed. Then, again, because they needed room and space to travel, this was a Chevrolet Nomad, which was a huge, huge vehicle. And now, this is my favorite. I've always said anything with gull-wing doors, I'm a sucker for. But this was a 1956 Mercedes 300 SL gull-wing sports car. He also owned a 56 Mercedes 300C four-door sedan. Back to his love of small cars, the 56 Beetle. And the same year, in 56, he bought a Carmen Ghia. And the note says that he bought it in 56 and put a new engine in it in 58. This is a Bentley Sedanka made in 1953. He did not buy it until 1958, which I think would make it his last car. He died in 1959 at 91. From 1935 on, the vast majority, if not all, of his cars were painted Cherokee red. It was not a Pantone color. It was a color he made up. There were 2 versions of it, one earlier and one later. And he said he chose it because it was such an American color and an earth color, and represented the Native Americans using earth tones in their pottery and art. So it's hard to tell. That one looks a little winier than the usual Cherokee red, but I'm not sure. Then this last photograph is of him with Taliesin in the back, and I can't encourage you enough, if you're ever anywhere near, go. And his hand resting on the bench.